So the Lotus Sutra, which I'm going to talk about today, is one of the most important scriptures in Mahayana Buddhism. And reciting it is considered very meritorious. So people will sometimes recite it to create auspicious circumstances or to prepare spiritually for a special time or event. You can recite the Lotus Sutra at times when you want to create auspicious circumstances, when something special is going on or something like that. Change of seasons is a good time. I got interested in it myself when I was asked at White Center to talk about it. And they were getting new statues from Vietnam. And because the new statue was coming in, the monks would be chanting the Lotus Sutra in Vietnamese to accompany this. And some of the Vietnamese members thought it would be helpful for me to explain it to the English speakers so that they'd know what was going on. And so I ended up doing kind of a crash course on the Lotus Sutra and giving a series of talks over it that lasted several months. I'm not going to do that today. So I will touch on a few of the kind of key teachings that I think are important. So I suspect when the average person thinks about the idea of sacred literature, they don't give a thought to how it came to be in existence. I grew up Protestant Christian, and I remember asking, where did the Bible come from? And the answer I got was, well, it's the Word of God. So, okay, how did God get it here? I didn't get an answer to that question until a lot later when I studied religion in college. And so Judeo-Christian literature started from sources in different oral traditions, and then people started writing them down. And the Christian canon was finally settled around 350 AD, give or take 50 years. So I mentioned this just to give you a little perspective for understanding the Buddhist canon. And actually to say the Buddhist canon is a little misleading. There are multiple canons because Buddhism spread, and as it spread, it evolved. And so the canon is vast in its entirety. The Pali Canon alone, which is the original teachings, takes up about 15 feet of bookshelf space. Fortunately, you don't have to read it all. And in fact, a lot of the canonical work is mostly of interest to scholars and historians and things like that. So the historical Buddha, Sakyamuni Buddha, lived as a human being about 2,500, 2,600 years ago, and he gave the teachings that constitute the basics of Buddhism as it appears in the Pali Canon, which is probably mostly what you're familiar with, things like the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, and the teachings on non-self and impermanence. So what's in that canon were either spoken by the Buddha or a close disciple or collected in commentaries on those teachings. So when a Christian talks about the Word of God, they're generally talking about how what they consider to be God spoke through a human being, or in the case of Jesus, through the Son of God. So similarly, we have this idea in Buddhism called Buddha Vachana, which means the word of the Buddha. The word of the Buddha includes anything that was spoken directly by the Buddha, inspired directly by the Buddha, spoken in the presence of the Buddha and approved of by him, or fully consistent with the intent of the Buddha. And so there's a lot of things that the Buddha himself didn't personally say, but that are aligned with the teachings, and thus accepted as the word of the Buddha, even though they appeared quite a while after the death of the historic Sakyamuni Buddha. So the Lotus Sutra, and the full title is something more like the Sutra on the White Lotus of the Sublime Dharma, falls into this category of teachings that are consistent with the intent of the Buddha, but it didn't appear until about 600 years after his death. So it was probably composed in stages, and each stage dealing with different teachings, or commenting and analyzing the ones that came before. So the key teachings that I'm going to talk about today, and there are several of them, but kind of the ones that everyone comes back to, are the teachings of skillful means. So this is where we get the Mahayana concept itself, the idea that there's one vehicle a great vehicle that encompasses all the Buddha's teachings. And it also explains that we're practicing together with the ultimate aim of Buddhahood, of supreme perfect enlightenment. And then the second of these key teachings is the teaching on Buddha nature, the idea that all beings have the potential at heart to become Buddhas. Even evil people and animals and ghosts and things like that can become Buddhas. And then the third is the divine body of the Buddha. So this goes to the nature of Buddha as a being that transcends space and time. Now, this is not something that we talk about a lot in the West, but it's important in terms of Asian Buddhism. So the first chapter of the Lotus Sutra is kind of an introduction, but it really is designed to prepare the mind to receive this teaching, especially this third concept of the Buddha as a divine body. So in it, Sakyamuni Buddha is meditating at the top of a mountain outside Rajgir, India. And gathered around him are a great many people, as well as heavenly beings and demigods and mythical creatures. And among them are human devotees at varied degrees of enlightenment, and a number of bodhisattvas, Buddhas that live in heavenly form. So as he's sitting in meditation, the Buddha begins to emit a ray of light from a tuft of white hair at his forehead. And the light begins to reveal every corner of the universe in all directions, down to the lowest hells and up to the highest heavens. And as this light appears, flowers begin to rain down from the heavens, and the fragrance of sandalwood wafts on the breeze. Well, everyone assembled there is kind of wondering what's going on here. And the Bodhisattva Manjushri, who's kind of the embodiment of wisdom and power, is there. And he says that in a previous existence, he had seen an omen very similar to this. And he says that he thinks that this signifies that Sakyamuni Buddha is about to deliver a very special teaching. So this introduction is kind of dealing with us in two realms. And in doing so, it prepares us for the rest of the sutra, which has us looking at things in terms of two different kinds of reality. So this is hard to explain in normal intellectual processes. And so the introduction is doing this, kind of pushing us into this reality through the use of poetic device. It's hard to explain, but I'm going to try to explain it anyway. So things happen in space and time. I woke up this morning when the alarm went off, walked the dogs, took a shower, ate breakfast, drove for an hour and a quarter or so, arrived here. And now I'm standing here talking to you. So this phenomenon that I identify as me is an object that I can recognize when I look in the mirror, and it's moved through a measurable space and time along with other objects, and I can identify and describe them. And so you would call this what we would refer to as historical reality, or maybe conventional reality. So in one sense, the Lotus Sutra is dealing with historical reality. It contains descriptions of historical beings that actually existed and phenomena that actually occurred. So our physical form is inseparable from our consciousness. This wouldn't be me without both form and mind. And so being physical forms, we perceive reality as physical phenomena. That's conventional knowledge. I can see what comes in through the eye, I can hear what comes in through the ear, taste what comes through the tongue, and so on. I even perceive what arises in the mind as a sort of sensory experience. And so this first chapter establishes this historical context. Rajgir is a real place in northern India. You can go there and visit this actual mountaintop. The Buddha was a real person who was born, lived, and died. And this all happens in a time that can be measured and dated with things like carbon dating and archaeology and so on. But if you visit this actual mountain where the Buddha delivered this discourse, you will see for yourself that the assembly that he addressed, according to the sutra, could not have really been there in space and time. So the Buddha is said in this to have been accompanied by countless beings, 20,000 followers, 80,000 bodhisattvas, 60,000 gods, and all these mythical creatures and all of this. But this is a very small mountaintop. If there were more than a few dozen people there, it would be crowded. And so this helps the mind to kind of open up to the idea that we're dealing in a different kind of reality here. And then the Buddha emits a ray of light from a tuft of hair at his forehead, and so magically shows all this other stuff that's going on to these assembled beings. And so what we see is that normal concepts of space don't apply in the world of the Lotus Sutra that we're about to experience. In fact, what we're learning in this chapter is that space and time are not meaningful in this particular context. We're in the world of emptiness now, of sunyata, which is a concept in which concepts no longer apply. There's no coming, no going, no me, no you, and so on. We're in the world of oneness. So the Buddha here isn't just one historical Buddha, but the Buddha that is the Dharma body, the Buddha that is eternal, the embodiment of compassion, of enlightenment itself. And you can't understand that Buddha through normal methods of reason and analysis. You have to understand that Buddha through faith and practice. So, when most people come to Buddhism, if I ask, what are you here for? They'll answer different things. Some people want to learn how to meditate because they've heard it'll lower their blood pressure. Some are just looking for spiritual community. A few will say, well, I'd like to be enlightened, but a lot of them, haven't really given a lot of thought to what that means. Mostly they're looking to deal with less stress in their life, and that's fine. But what this is talking about with the idea of skillful means is that there's only one path. The path takes different forms, but the Buddha is pointing out that there's one ultimate vehicle that can take us to the highest destination. And so this progression of purpose is what we mean when we say skillful means. And there's a story in the Lotus Sutra that helps explain this idea. So this man had, for some reason, run away from home at a young age. And he had traveled around and tried to make his way and had ended up destitute. And so while traveling around the country trying to eke out a living, he had accidentally returned home. So since he had left home, his father had become a very successful, wealthy man. And for many years, he had been wishing that his son would come back. And now, as his life was coming closer to its end, he was fearing that his wealth would be scattered. And so when his son came to the palace looking for work, he recognized him right away and he was overjoyed. But his son saw this grand palace and all this wealth, and he was afraid. He thought he wouldn't fit in there, and he didn't realize that it was his father's house. He had spent so long living in poverty, he thought that he didn't have any business at such a grand place. And so he started to leave. Well, his father saw him leaving, and he was like, no. And he sent servants out to get him and bring him back. Well, when the servants came to get him, he was so terrified, he actually collapsed in a faint. And he thought they were coming to accuse him of some crime and take him off to prison or something. And so he fainted. Well, his father said, well, I'm going to have to be a little bit more subtle. And so he had some servants dressed in soiled rags and go and seek out his son in the village, and offered him a job coming around the palace cleaning up trash and filth. Well, his son thought, okay, I'm up to that task. And so he accepted this job. But over the next several years, the son would do very well. And so he would get better and better jobs. He'd get more and more responsibility. And finally, he had progressed to the point where he was able to accept his father's kindness. And once he was able to do that, his father could reveal the truth of his birth to him. So the Buddha is saying we're like this son. When we first come to the Dharma, most of us are just looking for relief from our stress and can't imagine that we can even conceive of something like the level of compassion and wisdom required to become a Buddha. And then as we work with the teachings that we're able to practice, over time we develop greater levels of understanding and a greater compassion for kindness and compassion. And only then can we accept the kindness of a Buddha who wants to help us also become Buddhas. So in another chapter, the Buddha is talking about this in a similar way. And he says that he looks into the hearts of beings and offers the best teaching to them based on what they need at the time. And he uses the allegory of rain falling from the sky onto a field of medicinal plants. So in the world, there are many different kinds of plants with many different properties, just as there are many different kinds of people and many different kinds of living beings. Every plant needs water, but not every plant needs the same amount of rain. Some need more, some need less. And not every medicinal plant has the same benefit. Some are good for the stomach, some are good for headaches, some increase your alertness, some relax you. Medicinal plants do what they do in different forms too. You might make a tea out of one, chew on a root, powder the bark, things like that. But the rain falls without any regard for that. It falls under the leaves of the plants and it saturates the soil. And each plant takes what it needs and uses it in its own way. And in the same way, the Dharma is available to all, but not everyone benefits from it the same way. We benefit based on our properties. It's there for us to use if we just accept it and let it nourish our needs and capabilities. So what is the Dharma nourishing? It's nourishing our Buddha nature, the seed of Buddhahood that lies within us all. So several years ago, when I was still writing for the newspaper, I was driving to work along US Highway 92 one day, which is a major 4-lane road from DeLand to Daytona Beach. And that particular morning, I noticed that there was a car parked in a cut-through in the median. And there were two people in these bright fluorescent safety vests out walking around in the median, and they were sticking these little white flags down in the ground. Well, there's quite a few of these flags, and I realized they were scattered along the median for several miles. So I thought, well, maybe there's a story here. So I turned around and went back, and I pulled alongside their car. And I got out, and I started walking through the median, and they yelled, "Stop!" And they motioned me to stay where I was, and they came over to me, and they said, "You just have to be careful where you walk so you don't step on the orchids." So these little white flags were there to protect these wild orchids that bloom in the median of Highway 92. And so they're there to keep them from getting mowed. So I looked closely at these flowers. These are not big, showy orchids. They're small, kind of rusty, reddish spikes that grow less than a foot high, but they're very, very rare, very precious, very prized by people who are interested in orchids. Most of the year, you can't see them. They're mainly a big root system, so they're underground except for a few weeks in the spring, and even then, most people don't notice they exist. Thousands of vehicles pass by every day, but almost no one notices the orchids are there. So they're kind of like bodhisattvas in that way. Bodhisattvas are Buddhas to be. Most people don't notice them because they're too wrapped up in whatever they think is important at the moment. But if we look more closely, we find these rare beings. If we pay attention, we start to see things that support us. They're not rare like these orchids. They're really abundant, but to notice them is rare. We're so caught up in focusing on ourselves that we miss the ways we're connected to all these bodhisattvas that help us to fulfill our purpose. They may not look like big golden Buddhas, but they offer us countless opportunities to move toward Buddhahood ourselves. So in the Lotus Sutra, the Buddha says that while he comes and goes in human form to bring the Dharma to beings in the world, Buddhahood is actually eternal. He says, in order to save living beings, as expedient means I appear to enter nirvana, but in truth I do not pass into extinction. I'm always here preaching the law. I'm always here, but through my powers, I make it so that living beings in their befuddlement don't see me even when I'm close by. But when I look at living beings, I see them drown in a sea of suffering. And I don't show myself because I want them to thirst for me. And then when their minds are filled with yearning, at last I appear and reveal the Dharma to them. He explains that some people will respond to instructions on how to eliminate the patterns of thinking that keep bringing them back to the cycle. Others will want to realize emptiness and become bodhisattvas and liberate all beings. For those people, he is mortal in the conventional sense, but some will understand that Buddha nature is essentially eternal. And so for them, he reveals that he's always among us. Just like those orchids are there beneath the earth, even when we can't see the blooms. And just like we get help from countless bodhisattvas, even when we overlook them.